Hi, my name is Sam Atwood, and I'll be giving a presentation on cultural rhetoric and style. So, what is cultural rhetoric? Cultural rhetoric is arguably the most wide-spreading branch of rhetoric. Angela Haas, in Interfacing Cultural Rhetorics, defines rhetoric in general as the negotiation of cultural information to engage participation and social action. So, in this sense, rhetoric is always already cultural. How someone engages with the world is first and foremost affected by the culture they grew up in. It affects every aspect of how they communicate, from how they speak to how they dress. So, how is cultural rhetoric related to style? Style is visual, but it is also deeply cultural. A man wearing a kilt is likely to get a different response in Scotland than they would in America, for instance. The kilt would probably be recognized in Scotland as something ancestral, so respectable, but maybe outdated depending on the situation. In America, people might recognize it the same way. Unfortunately, because it looks like a skirt, people might also assume that the man is effeminate. Gender norms are very strongly reinforced in America, so viewers might emphasize the violation of gender norms over the representation of culture. People express themselves in order to communicate parts of their identity to others, and as Barry Brunt says, styles are like languages in their systematicity, their ability to communicate, and their connections to specific human communities. By dressing in a certain way, people can tell other people things about their personality or their culture without actually saying anything. In talking about his own Black cultural identity, Andre Brock describes three elements of cultural representation. Firstly, stereotype. How does one display the complexity of their identity to a world intent on fixity or sameness? Secondly, interiority. How much of our professed identity is shaped by what we think the world expects of us? And thirdly, exteriority. How much of our identity is shaped by the context in which we find ourselves? While these three modes of representation are talking about Brock's identity in particular, I think they are an excellent method of analyzing how clothes represent the complex identities of different subcultures. For instance, Lolita style is a fascinating example of culture expressed through clothing. Figure 2 displays an example of the type of clothing Lolita style can involve. However, like any expression of individuality, Lolita style can involve many different types of expression. For those who are unaware, Lolita fashion is originally a Japanese creation that has its roots in two sources. Lolita, the 1955 book by Vladimir Nabokov, that involves the seduction of a 12-year-old girl that the main character nicknames Lolita, and the Japanese idea of shoujo, or a romanticized image of uncorrupted innocence and beauty. Because of this idea of shoujo, the translated version of Lolita was interpreted as a reminder of the nostalgia of youth in Japan, as opposed to the uncomfortable predatory sexuality of the man in the West. Lolita plays interestingly into Brock's concept of stereotype. While many types of fashion rebel against or play into what the world expects of the subculture wearing them, Lolita clothing rebels by playing into fixity, in a sense. Japan places strong social restrictions on different groups, but both men and women are pressured to conform and become contributing members of society. Like many parts of the world, Japanese women are expected to perform a subservient role for men, to the point where how they act in public and in private is supposed to please men first and foremost. Lolita style instead exaggerates the femininity and innocence that women are expected to display. In fact, it's to the point of, visually at least, regressing to a childlike state and one with almost untouchable purity. There's a phrase in Japanese that a woman is an iron fist in a velvet glove, and in this way, Lolita increases the size of the velvet glove and implicitly increases the size of the iron fist inside. It also bucks against the fixity of Japanese society by making a woman's body and choices her own. While the idea of embracing femininity wholeheartedly in order to rebel is less common in American society, it shows how rhetoric can differ from culture to culture, especially when you compare Western culture to Asian culture. Because of this essential weaponization of stereotype, the interiority of Lolita style is made very exterior. It takes what Japanese culture expects of women and turns it up to 11. It takes ideas that are palatable to men and makes those ideas into something that women enjoy. This exaggeration of an ideal is a version of ironic love, where it becomes hard to argue with something that is, on its face, giving a group what they want. As an aside, while the style can be empowering for women, it can also be taken and co-opted by a larger patriarchal culture as well. Since this is a family-friendly presentation, I won't show an example, but I will just say that a style of dress exaggerating what's appealing to men can also easily be made into a fantasy for them. It's very common for ruling class and people to make the unpalatable palatable again. While I've mentioned how the Lolita style is shaped by cultural expectations, it also works the other way around too. The clothing of Lolita styles certainly could exist on their own, especially since it is heavily based on the frills and modesty of the European Victorian era. However, it would have significantly different cultural context if it were simply imported from a different country. Um, Japanese culture does romanticize Western culture in the same way that Western culture rep- romanticizes Japanese culture. So this does have an effect on things, and I can see a Japanese person dressing up in these clothes purely because they're interesting and exotic to them. Arguably, though, Lolita style has taken its Western influences and made them into a uniquely Japanese creation. Women find themselves in a cultural context where they want to express themselves and be free to act how they want. But they're also constrained by a society that doesn't want them to do either of those things. So, in a way, that's kind of counter to how Western feminism views empowerment. Japanese women can be freer and enjoy themselves by doing something that seems like acquiescing. This was a very specific look at a very specific subculture, but it proves how much meaning is intertwined in the simple act of getting dressed. Style is a means of communication and personality, as well as cultural allegiances. Maybe the next time you put clothes on, consider the meaning behind what you're wearing.